Thank you, Bryan.
You're welcome.
I introduced Bryan as the most trusted fake news journalist in the country, and he's joined today by the least trusted fake news journalist in Australia. Please welcome from The Chaser, Mr. Julian Morrow.
Hello.
Don't you love these descriptions?
Absolutely. That was magnificent, though. I think I might try to hire Sir Murray. He's magnificent.
He's a shocker, isn't he? He gets worse as he gets on. I've got no control over the baby.
Now, gents, what I'm supposed to do now is read your long and illustrious bios and talk more about your radio, TV, film, Clark and Dawe, the games, Julian the Chaser, Giant Dwarf, the Checkout. But
It's all lies.
I thought you'd
does
appreciate
it say it puts you to sleep?
Well, what
Audience.
I did was I thought I'd take the temperature of the man on the street, see how they might describe you. So I actually asked Doug at the security desk
Oh, yeah.
what he thought you do. But he's actually never heard of either of
That's
us.
right, yeah.
Excellent.
He's a very discerning man, Doug. Yeah.
I've always said that about
Absolutely.
Doug. Yeah. No, you can take him anywhere.
Ladies and gents, today you are the meat in this sandwich of truthiness, and we're looking forward to getting some of your questions in the mix of the conversation. So if you see me checking my phone, it's because hopefully I'll be given some questions from you guys. And
I'll be updating my Facebook status if you see me up there.
Yeah.
This event is very well organised, so organised in fact that I actually got sent the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of satire. Oh. It says, the employment of sarcasm, irony and ridicule in denouncing, exposing or deriding vice, folly, abuses or evils of any kind. In the interests of balance, I consulted the Devil's Dictionary of 1911 by Ambrose Bierce, who declared that the satirist is popularly regarded as a sour-spirited knave. And then I had to go back to the Oxford Dictionary to look up knave,
better.
which is a dishonest or unscrupulous man. Julian Morrow, how do you describe what you do?
Look, I've just got to say, if I had known that was the definition of satire, I wouldn't have got into this business in the first place. That's very revealing.
It is.
I mean, Bryan mentioned before the difference between comedy and satire. I think much of the stuff I've been involved in is probably more comedy than satire, but essentially it is about looking at powerful institutions and taking the piss and trying to drag them down. I'm not sure whether that is to any particular effective end other than passing the time, but it was certainly something that always motivated The Chaser, because we started wanting to do topical satire, looking at the news of the week and having an angle on it. And at some level, that just reflected our interest in news and politics.
What's the next step in that drag them down, though? And I wonder, Bryan, where you sit on that. Do you have a kind of an end goal in mind? Are you thinking of the reaction of your audience?
No, I mean, in a lot of ways, the one thing that John and I both agreed about very, very early on, and we were consistent about it, was that we came from the audience and we are the audience. And in a lot of ways, that's what we were doing there. We were basically there on behalf of the audience. And we acknowledge that there have been people out in the audience who are far funnier and more satirical than we were. In John's case, I find that hard to believe, but that's where we came from. We always saw it through their eyes. And perhaps that's why our relationship with the audience sustained for so long, is that I think the audience knew that. An old fella said to John once, he said, you know what you two do? He said, you know what you're up to? And John said, no, tell me. He said, it's a secret between you and the audience, you two. And John loved that, and so did I. And I thought, well, that's pretty much right. And that also then determines who you look at and whatever. I mean, we can get into discussing all that, but that's where we came from.
Yeah, well, let's get into it. How do you pick your subjects or
in
your
Australia?
targets?
Gee, hard.
Yeah, it's more how do you narrow it down? Yeah.
Jesus, I mean, we never had a problem with material, and it's interesting now, I mean, they're doing the reruns from many, many years ago, and you look at it and, I mean, I haven't, but people have said, God, it's like that one. When did you do that? And I said, I think the 90s, and it could have been done last week. because basically nothing's changed, really. I mean, I think you could write down the things that actually changed. A lot of it's got worse, but, you know, not a lot. There's plenty of material.
That's right. And I mean, at some level, topical comedy, it's essentially reactive. I don't think there's such a thing as investigative satire. You can't sort of uncover the story and then take the piss out of it at the same time. So the topics select themselves. It becomes a question of what angle to have on it. And over the years, that becomes difficult because you've done it so many times before.
Yeah. Right. And I think also that there's nothing illuminating about stating the obvious about something. And the trick, I think, is to find the bit that informs, other than anybody can get up there and do like political comedy in that, ha ha ha, that's funny, that I can see that bit. But what John's writing was was brilliant at, was he was able to, with the lightest touch, be able to examine the issue and reduce it down to its most basic form.
Yeah, find something. I mean, I remember watching you guys as a teenager at school.
That's tragic.
Yeah. And just, you know, a well-chosen joke would get to the essence of the issue and sum it up in a way that I hadn't encountered by watching the news or reading the newspapers, which stands in stark contrast to a student I encountered who came up to me after the Chasers War and everything one day and said, "Oh, yeah, I really like your show. When I started watching it, I didn't get a lot of the topical references because I didn't watch the news. And now I watch the news, I get a lot of the references. I don't like the show as much now, but I understand it more."
Is your work partly also a product of your frustration with the world?
Yeah, and that's got worse. I mean, I don't watch, this is a terrible revelation, I don't watch television anymore. I don't listen to the news. First thing in the morning, I'll go and have a look at what the broad world news is, and then I'll go to the ABC online and wish I hadn't, because it highlights how bad it is. And it's just not informing us properly, and we have become insular. And I think because I lived overseas for 3 months this year, I'm really feeling that thing when I come back to Australia, that we're treading water, we're not moving. So that frustrates me like all hell, because this country is so much better.
Well, Julian, on your point of sort of simplifying complex issues, or I guess promoting news literacy, Rolling Stone magazine called Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert America's Anchors. And there have been loads of studies that sort of show that their viewers are equally as informed as network news viewers. Not necessarily confirming that either contain substantial news content, just that they are equally as informed. Do you think that's the job of satire as well, or is that a separate sort of spin-off?
I don't think that's the job of satire, but definitely, I mean, Jon Stewart was the pioneer of this, and actually it probably does verge on investigative satire, what he started doing and what John Oliver does today. I think they're the pioneers of using media clips, the back catalogue of public figures, as the sort of the setup for the joke. And I remember speaking to someone from the Daily Show about new technology they had that was about basically being able to search what public figures had said by transcripts and getting to the video. And he said that this is the one piece of technology which I can honestly say makes the Daily Show funnier. So I don't think it's inherent to the job of satire, but I think it's something that has become more and more possible with technology, and that Stewart and Colbert and Oliver do fantastically well. And I actually, probably the only thing I would disagree with is that I think that you'd end up with as much news content out of watching The Daily Show as you do watching the news. I mean, I find that thinking about The Checkout. The Checkout is much faster paced than your average news and current affairs show. And I think if you look at the content of information in the half hour, probably stacks up with a half hour of proper television.
What does that mean? Proper television. That's an oxymoron, isn't it? It's like Microsoft Word.
That's right. That's an aspirational name.
Yeah, it is.
What about speaking truth to power? And Bryan, I wonder if over your decades with John, did you ever feel daunted or intimidated by taking on a particular institution or maybe a more specific person?
No, well, you didn't so much as take them on. I mean, people said, do you ever come across politicians and what do they like? What do they think of this? And I said, I don't want to see a politician ever again. I was in Canberra about a week ago, and thankfully I had to do a talk at the Great Hall, and Parliament wasn't sitting, so I was blessed that there was none around. But basically that's not what's driving you, and it doesn't matter what they think. We're not interested in them personally. We're interested in the policy that they're driving and the bullshit they're selling. That's what we're interested in, and it always has been that way. Our stuff's been pretty simple, really. It's not been complicated, and it really didn't change very much, you know.
So you've never had a moment with a politician that you can share, where someone's grabbed you by the throat?
But they're always going to say, you know, I mean, Bob Hawke one night, he's going, mate, yeah, love your work. You hated us. I know that. We talked about your penis in one episode and mentioned it 12 times on national television. You're not going to tell me you liked that.
Yeah.
But their opinion was irrelevant, you know, and I'm more interested in how they run the country.
Yeah.
And also, when you work at the ABC, there are plenty of other people to be fearful and worried that
Yes,
they will do
exactly.
that for you.
Yeah.
Your job is just to focus on the jokes and the topics.
Yeah, well, that's right. And also with the ABC now, they've got to the point where balance is just ridiculous. There can be no balance with all these things. There are certain things like refugees and like the environment and like Adani selling off that ridiculous situation that they have there. Where's the balance in that?
So if you feel so strongly on those issues, are you agitating for change as such, as a consequence of your satire?
Oh yeah, I'd like to see them all gone. And some new young people in there running the place. I mean, let's get a version of New Zealand quickly. Please, you know, don't you reckon?
What about you, Julian?
It's certainly your interest in politics and your, sometimes it is anger at the way things turn out that motivates you. But I would never think that, I mean, if you really want to be directly involved in activism, that's what you should do, and political change comes from the people who do those seriously hard yards. It's nice sometimes that those people feel supported or validated by some of the jokes you make on the sidelines.
Yeah.
But I'm under no illusions about the, at least our content contributing to change. I think they're separate things.
I think it's geeing up, in a lot of ways it's geeing up the troops. I remember Rod Conto and said what he did, it didn't change anything, but he said what I do is I gee up the troops and I keep them there. And he did that brilliantly for 40 years. And in a way, I think a part of us, we were doing a similar thing where at least people went, oh God, it's not just me that we know. Because people do know. I mean, if we could go on to the next part of the section of this bit about, they know there's now a disconnect between the people and the politicians. It is so obvious and it's not just in Australia, it's everywhere that I've been. And it's, the audience knows what's going on. They just can't do anything about it. You know, you're serious that people would allow this postal vote? If they thought they could change that, they'd do something about it, but they can't. And it'll get up. There's no doubt about that. Are we serious? This is not going to happen? Of course it's going to happen. Question of when. So great leadership would say, let's just deal with it. So and then we'd be out of a job, and that'd be good. Best thing that can happen in society is you don't have any political satirists. You don't need them. Here,
think it was
John and I
Saddam
were-
Hussein who said that.
we were going to start, John and I were starting to farm work out. Clark and Dawe franchise, is that what we were setting up?
The flip side, I guess, of speaking truth to power is that, and maybe John Oliver knows this best at the moment from last week tonight, he spoke his truth. He's now facing some pretty serious litigation from powerful people. Clark and Dawe was at one stage investigated for allegedly vilifying Christians.
Apparently. I read that in your thing.
Did you
How
do
much
it?
notice is... No. Why would we vilify Christians? That's really silly. You know, it's like to say all Christians are the same. Well, they're not, clearly. And why would you do that? It's crazy. No, but look, we were lucky. We got lucky with we came at, we were pre-internet. And John and I kept a pretty low profile publicly with a lot of stuff. We stayed away from most things. I always remember Clark saying to me, he said, I said, so-and-so wants us to do an article in the paper. He said, oh, shouldn't do that. And I said, okay. He said, yeah, publicity never made you funnier, Brian. And we adopted that sort of thing. But we kept a pretty low thing. I mean, Jared Henderson hated us. And he was vitriolic towards us every week. It used to give him... Did he do that with you guys?
Yeah, the best piece of advice I got from Mark Scott ever was, he said, you just never reply to correspondence from Jared Henderson. And that is a life lesson. If you go away with nothing from today, just don't engage.
From both of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you had these people on there. There was one guy called, what's his name? Ozzy Matters, his name was. And every week he would come on there and online and lay shit on the segment we just done. Every week. And you thought, God, it's so tempting to say something. And I thought, no, you don't. You don't.
Julian, you've had your own run-ins with authority. Several members of your team were charged with...
You're talking about that parking fine? Yeah, no.
That and being charged with offences under APEC legislation.
Oh, that one too, yes. Yeah.
Can you talk us through that day?
This is very un-Australian, this man.
I mean, that was a stunt that went horribly right. We never planned... The whole design of the stunt was our assumption that it wouldn't work. And it was a bit of a curse because, that was back in... It was more than 10 years ago now, but it was when the Chasers War and everything was going fairly well as a show. And when you do stunts, it's pretty fair to say that the last thing you want is for the world's biggest conference and the world's biggest security operation to turn up in your backyard. Like that's... And everyone's like, what are you going to do? And we just assumed we'd not be able to do anything. The idea for the motorcade actually came in a quite amusing context. I was invited into a meeting, a pre-APEC meeting with the ABC executive producer. I thought, here we go. This is going to be, we're going to have the Riot Act read to us or the Special Powers Riot Act read to us or whatever. And there was a security consultant who was telling us all this sort of stuff. But all these security consultants, a lot of them are like ex-SAS, they're soldiers. They love it. They love the danger. And at the end, he said, look, seriously, there's going to be this ring of security and then that ring of security, and really the only way that you could possibly get in there is if you had a motorcade yourself. I'm like, oh, that is a good idea. And so, okay, well, and all the guys said, well, how was the meeting? I said, well, there's actually one thing that was quite...
There was a good takeaway from that meeting.
That's right, yeah. And so all we added was the Osama bin Laden dress-up, which was essentially because we just assumed we were going to get stopped at the first gate. And one of the big problems we had after it all went down was how to try and make it funny, because it's like funnier in principle than it actually was as a piece of television.
Yes.
And the reason we stopped the motorcade, we got in, and I went over to Chaz, and we're like, well, we're in.
What do we do now?
Yeah. We could have gone all the way down to the Opera House.
Yeah. Could have got shot, too.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so the reason Chaz got out of the motorcade was because we thought, well, that'll be funnier, and of course it was. And then the actual punchline of the piece of television wasn't in any way scripted, because we noticed that when we got out, and I said to the guy, I'm from the Chaser, all the cops came and arrested me, and they left Osama bin Laden walking next to him with his guys.
Yeah. You're going to have to repeat a year.
Were you at any stage genuinely frightened?
It was a very strange day, and what was most strange about it was how quiet it was and how eerily sort of silent it was. I did once meet a guy. I said, "Oh, I've had you in my crosshairs." Oh, good.
Thanks.
Yeah, but it's not like those sorts of things are things that you're aware of in the moment. So we were more focused on how to sort of pull off the stunt that we'd planned and how to do the comedy.
Yeah.
We're more worried about getting back to the office with nothing than getting arrested.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think on the way, I remember going down and looking at the motorcade at the back of the AVC and thinking, oh, fuck, that looks pretty real. That's, I reckon that, that sort of seemed like it might work.
Yeah.
But you're just in a different headspace when you're doing it. And so, no, we weren't that worried at the time. And, you know, and we were very fortunate. It was actually amazing that, I mean, it seemed to tap into a vibe at the time.
Yeah.
And which is what I like. I mean, we were actually trying to make a serious point in a very silly way.
Yeah. The timing was amazingly.
It was. Yeah. I mean, the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, not one of our biggest supporters, had a front page the next day saying, "Thank God it was them." Yeah. And so we're like, oh, well, there you go. That's. I mean, normally, if only 70% of the Australian population hated us, we were like, oh, this is a good one. We're going well here. But that was different. That was like 90% of people liked it. And then the institutions of our little old democracy actually kicked in, and all the charges were dropped by the statutorily independent Director of Public Prosecutions.
Yeah.
Over despite the wishes of the New South Wales Police Commissioner. So we were pretty lucky in the end.
Yeah. You have those things where, for example, John and every time the ABC board met for almost 20 years, on the agenda was to sack Clark and Dawe. And Ramona Cavall, who used to do the book program, told us that she was the staff rep and she'd be at the meetings and they'd all go, yep, that's got to happen. And this is during the Howard period, and she would wait to the end and go, who's getting up to tell them, the audience, that we got rid of them? Yes, we'll move along to the next one, every week, every month.
There's a great question here from M, who's in the audience, who says, Bryan and Julian, are you part of the problem in breeding cynicism and disengagement?
Yes.
She spotted us. Yeah. First of all, I've got a clear thought on cynicism, and we're sceptic. Well, I think we're both sceptical, but I think the others are cynical, and that's why we exist. Yeah. I'm not cynical at all. Sceptical, definitely, and as you are.
That's a very good answer. I mean, I think it is definitely the case that satire that's done in parts of the world where freedom of speech is not a given, is much more clearly associated and more directly associated with progress. Bassem Youssef in Egypt being one of the most striking recent examples. But look, I mean, I think if you were to allocate blame for the woes in our political system, you wouldn't be putting too much to the people who are taking the piss out of it, I have to say.
Zana says, how can the disconnect between people and power be solved?
I just posed the question. I don't have any answers. Look, this goes on to a bigger question for me anyway. I think what we are watching, not only in Australia, clearly, obviously in America, it's happened in Britain, it's happening in Spain in its own way. I think we are watching the downfall of the Western civilization, and it will take a long time, but I think we're on the way. The ship's not going to turn around in a way that this question might be asked, that someone's going to turn it around and it's going to be Leave It to Beaver here again at some point. I don't think so. And if you look at history, if you read your history, it's as it should be. It's the way it went, the Ottoman Empire. You go back to the great empires which have an interest in the Arabic world, and they talk about 500 years as like that. I mean, this guy was there with the family for 500 years, and it fell, and they all fall, and they keep falling.
Well,
And-
that's bloody depressing, Bryan.
Well, it's not depressing, it's realising that this is where we are. So what do we do about it? Look, the biggest question in this country at the moment is the environment. I mean, we can't get around that. And I would love to see, there was an African leader, a woman African leader that years ago I saw, it was just turned the television on and I went, that person knows more about this subject than anybody I've ever heard. And she got up and she was being interviewed about greenhouse gas emissions and whatever, and she said, what if we're wrong about this? Still a good idea, isn't it?
That was one of Tony
full
Abbott's
stop.
positions a while back, actually.
Yes,
He did
it
say that,
was.
but he's held pretty well every position since.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's just coming around
That's
on
right,
himself,
yeah,
isn't he?
yeah.
Yeah, but I think we just work our turf. That's all you can do.
I must say, I'm not as pessimistic
Pessimistic.
of that because I don't think
No.
it's technically possible to be more pessimistic than that. But
No. It's pretty good, isn't it? I mean, technically, that's pretty...
that's right, exactly.
Yeah.
But, you know, even I think that, you know, some of the core ideas of democracies and some of the core liberal freedoms are constantly inspiring to people, and I think that that will remain true all around the world. And while it's all, you know, I don't think history always goes forward. You know, things always get better. But I think that you know, I remember the depression of the Bush
30s.
years.
Yeah.
Well, there was that depression as well, the capital D. But you know, people were very disheartened in those days. Now it seems like, you know, an era of incredibly erudite leadership compared to what America has these days.
He was brilliant,
But
wasn't
yeah,
he,
that's
Bush?
right.
I just loved him.
I mean, even now, like Bush is coming out criticising Trump, but then, you know, a figure like Obama emerged, and you could debate his record, but certainly that was a recapturing of the idea of hope in America, and so I think things can turn around.
My problem with all this is when you look at something like the Panama Papers, and you look at 1% of which we know about and the bulk of which we don't, and the corruption now is so powerful within the West that our institutions, that's where I have a problem. If I have one conversation during the week, I have 15 conversations with someone who's got a problem with an electrical company or a phone company or whatever company, and it just appears that everyone's being ripped off all the time, or they're making it so, obfuscating this information so hard that you can't get a grip on it. And it's making us unhealthy, I think, certainly making me unhealthy. And I just see this sort of corruption going on in the West that I find it very hard to get around. And it is, at the moment, quite negative. I accept that.
Victor has posed a question, and he says, Jeffrey Robertson provocatively said that satire never changed anything. But Victor says it seems to be effective in Australia. Where else, says Victor?
Oh, America. I mean, you know, you look at Mark Twain and people like that. It was very effective for a period. It had, but then that period's different. I mean, you were talking about the Bush period. Well, boy, look at where we've come from in terms of technology, even from the Bush period. I mean, I remember the pre-internet, which is a worry. And you think some very good things have come out of that, but also we've lost some control. I think that's where the satire is coming from, the good satire I'm starting to see now online. And I think it's not necessary, you know, television's not where I would have thought it's all going.
Well, on that, with the changes to media landscape and dwindling free-to-air television audiences, perhaps newspaper circulation as well, the rise of Netflix and streaming and that kind of thing, it's becoming harder or easier to do good satire and find that audience for it, Julian?
Look, I think it's no easier or harder than ever, really. I think there's no doubt that the barriers to entry for people who want to do something different are lower than they've ever been.
Yeah.
You can get material, you can post it online, and it can You can build an audience from scratch much more easily than ever. There is a quantum leap from, the sort of really small-scale social media broadcasting to stuff that gets to everyone. And it is sometimes easier if you've got the platform of an old free-to-air network or something like that. But I think those things are in flux, but still providing more opportunities, not perfect opportunities. There are still barriers and it's harder for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. But I'm not pessimistic about. I think things are better than they've been.
Yeah, no, I'm actually quite positive about that.
There we go.
Thank you. One thing, write that down, will you?
Yeah, that's right.
As journalists lose jobs, does the need for satire rise?
I think
And the power of satire increase?
I think they're two separate things. Someone talked about satirical journalism, and I said there's satire and there's journalism. I mean, I think what we're losing, sadly, is a lot of very fine journalists in this country. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've lost some major people. But then on the other hand, there's some young people that are coming up who are doing wonderful work. But the problem is, are they going to have the newspaper behind them? I had this conversation with Leonore Taylor a week ago, and The Guardian are really, really aware of that issue. But it's not answering the question about satire, but for the journalists to maintain The Guardian is critical to maintaining good journalism in Australia. The satire is another thing, I think. I don't know what you think about that, but...
Look, I mean, having institutional support when you're attacked or taken on by the powerful is important or valuable. It's better to have than not, but I think there are examples of people who fight on regardless without that support. And I think, they're the particularly brave ones.
Yeah. A question from Jane in the audience who says, how do we inspire new satirists when they're not engaged with news or politics?
Well, if they're not engaged with news or politics, they're probably not future satirists, I'd
yeah,
say.
they're probably future gardeners,
yeah, that's
I would have thought.
Is anything off limits in what you do? And if so, how do you decide who can or can't be a target?
Mine's pretty simple. Again, it's never hit the victim. And you're the only one that can make up your mind whether that person's a victim. I mean, I see people, when they're doing political jokes, attacking, and you think, no, you're there to defend those people. That's your job, not to undermine them and whatever. So that's my bottom line. No, nothing's off limits. But if I consider they're in that territory, then they're not touched.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways of answering that. I mean, if you're saying, is there a topic which, in all circumstances, cannot be the subject of comedy or satire? That's nothing is off limits in that sense. But all jokes are a function of context, and contexts change. So the very same joke said by sometimes the very same person in a different context can mean something very different. So you're always involved in making judgment calls. We've probably got more of them wrong than most people over the years, but I suppose part of the ethos of the Chaser, at least, was to be near the line. And not that there isn't a line, but we wanted to be pushing the boundaries, and sometimes we only found out where the line was by going
afterwards.
That was the line.
We're in deep shit.
Was the 9/11 headline a moment where you looked back and saw the line?
Oh, no.
And can you just explain the
we had this slightly challenging moment of being in the Chaser offices trying to work out what the front page of the next edition should be as we were watching the planes go into the towers. And there were some people who thought, well, we just shouldn't do anything. I remember my colleague Charles Firth saying, so you're saying that in the face of the biggest news event of the decade, that we're just not going to do anything? I was like, okay, that's a fair point. I think what we ended up doing was actually a bunch of jokes, some of which were poor, others of which had no message but were quite funny. I quite liked Centre Point Jumps 2 in World's Tallest Buildings. Too soon. But then there were other things that were getting around the not the event itself, but the political reaction to the event, which was happening from the outset. The Onion held its fire for a while, but came up with some really fantastic satire within days. And the Onion had just moved its offices to New York. So of the things that where we went too far, I don't think 9/11 was really one of them.
You've just reminded me about the 9/11, that sometimes satire can be fairly random and you don't write it and it is handed to you on a plate. And I remember the day after 9/11, I had to fly up this way somewhere and then to an island off there to a conference and do a talk. And of course, the security, they just didn't know what to do. So the queues at Tullamarine were just out the building and whatever. So this is on a 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. flight. And standing in front of me, I couldn't believe it, was one P. Ruddock with bags, minders, the whole thing. And they...
I hope he didn't jump the queue, did he?
He
No.
did. The minder picked the thing up, got him, and they moved to a shorter
You're kidding
thing.
me. Oh, there you go.
At which point I thought, there is a God, Bryan. So I waited, and then I went at the top of my voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, the minister is queue jumping."
Fantastic.
Yay!
That's awesome.
Wow.
And the minder turned around and looked and went, Anyway, I couldn't wait to get off the plane in Brisbane and ring my friend Tony Wright from the Sydney Morning Herald. And he said, "Geez, you can get lucky sometimes, Bryan."
Yeah.
So he wrote an article, he was at the Bulletin at that stage, and it says, "Minister in moving violation." And apparently it was the talk of Canberra for a week. But that's when you get lucky.
Yeah.
And you have that...
Julian, you made the point before that you don't think there's such a thing as an investigative satirist.
I think I slightly retracted it afterwards, yeah.
Did you?
Well, I think what Oliver and Stuart are doing is closer to that. It's not uncovering news stories, because that's hard to do in terms of the setup for it. I mean, a joke is a sort of moment of understanding between the teller and the audience. And you've got to pack a bit of sort of premise into it, and it's hard to do if you're telling facts for the first time.
There's a lot of irony in that stuff, and that comes from the work of, okay, where's the irony here?
Yeah.
And that's what I find excellent about that, and that's also what John was very good at, is finding that, you know, I remember when my favourite stuff I ever did with John was when he played the little schoolboy, and I played the schoolmaster. And of course we couldn't look at each other because we just fall apart, so I'd always look at his top of his head, and because you just get this little boy thing in there. But there's that whole idea that all you had to do is get one or two things going, and you didn't have to say anything else. And this one happened to be about a bike. Why? He can't ride the bike. He doesn't even know how to ride the bike. Simon doesn't know how to ride a bike. This is Kim Beazley talking about Simon Thingo. And he said, and he said it was my turn to have a bike. I can't even ride the bike. And that's all we did for 2.5 minutes, just talking about the bike. And he goes, "Okay, Kim, right. Now, you said you were going to give him the bike, right? Okay. So will you give him the bike?" "Yeah." "Okay. And then he says, "Can I trust you?" "No." And it was those sort of things where you don't have to do too much at all.
Yeah. Can you be a conservative satirist?
Yeah. That'll be...
Philip Ruddock.
Yeah. I used to love it. When Jeff Kennett was in, we used to do that. The phone would go off during your talk and you'd go, "Red 7, Jeff."
I'm not sure that Bryan or I can be, but, PJ O'Rourke's a fantastic right-wing satirist.
Yeah.
You can be. There are fewer of them. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe the people who could...
Bad potty training, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe they've all, devoting the skills that could otherwise be applied to satire to, being in business and making money. I don't know.
Well, yeah, they're probably going and doing, $50,000 talks,
Right.
That's right.
workshops.
Bryan, you've mentioned your dear friend John Clarke a number of times this afternoon. And I just want to read, he wrote the foreword to Judy Horacek, the cartoonist, to her latest collection, which is called Random Life. And John Clarke wrote, "If you're not brought up in Australia, the things that impress you when you arrive here are the sheer space and flatness of the place, the remarkable birds, and the quality and audacity of the cartoonists. Like the birds, the cartoonists are beautifully adapted to their habitat and are varied in their use of it. And like the birds, some have powerful beaks and sharp talons. Others are elegant but are shy and seldom seen. Some squawk, some whistle, some cry." Have you reached a stage in your career where perhaps your squawk or your cry is ready to be quieter, or your talons aren't as sharp?
Absolutely. I've moved, here's the irony, of course, if you want to, as my friend said to me a couple of weeks ago, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. Because I was living in Tangier in Morocco for 3 months this year, and John and I are actually going to officially finish up at the end of this year. And of course, literally 6 weeks after I got back, he passed away. So it wasn't a question of the talons being any manicured. It was just that we both felt like we needed to move on, that we were, we're in the last quarter and the wind's blowing against us. We're not kids anymore. We've done it for 30 years, and it was time to follow other interests. John's using the bird metaphor there because John loved birds. And I've been doing photographic exercises and exhibitions and things for quite a while. And when I first started up, he decided to start up photography as well. But he decided to photograph birds. And John, for the first 6 months that he took it up, John produced some of the worst photographs of birds you have ever seen in your life. But like everything John Clarke did, he eventually became very, very good at it. And now, to this day, on Phillip Island, where I live and he has a house, he has the best collection of bird photographs ever taken of seabirds on Phillip Island. And he's done enormous work with birds and things like that. It's a long way around from this question, isn't it? And so no, we both need to move on. I was going back, as I will, to go and do more artwork and go and live for longer in Morocco. And he wanted to take off and go around Australia and take a year and not think about having to turn up every Wednesday with a script. And so no, you don't lose it. In fact, you just do other things, I think. That's me. I don't know about you.
Julian, are you as hungry as ever?
He's younger.
Look, it was a little bit different for us in the sense that the early years of the Chaser on television, you were doing stunts, and we were doing sketches and other things as well, but they were probably the stunts were the things we were best known for, and it was perfectly clear that was something that had a time limit to it. In fact, we knew from APEC, it's like, well, this is pretty well over now, because it's not something that you can repeat. It becomes harder and harder to do, but that just means that you stop a particular form of comedy. Some people move on to other things.
Yeah.
Definitely for me personally, moving to the checkout is something which I think has some of the attitude of the Chaser, but is equally concerned with conveying information as getting a laugh. So that's just a slightly different interest. I think every comedian, probably like any person in any job, will have different answers to that at different times.
Yeah.
There's also different ways. One of the issues about this is how, when you say you're satirist, and how you actually address the satire. Now, for example, the thing I miss about John Clarke the most wasn't Clarke and Dawe. We could do that standing on our head. We've done it for so long. But what I miss from him is the phone calls and the conversations we had and the emails. I mean, nobody wrote brilliant emails like John Clarke did. Every time he wrote, a friend of mine who's a Kiwi, and she said, the thing about John Clarke is he was incapable of being mundane. You know, if you sent an invoice to him for something and he'd write back and he'd say, Dear Mr. Dawe, thank you for the invoice. This will appear in your bank account on Thursday as race 6 Lassiter's boy ran with. We'll slip it through the Cayman Island account on the way to somewhere else. Warm regards, 1A.
That's great.
And another one I wrote, we'd get, like you guys would as well, you get invited to come and do charity stuff or do talks or blah, blah, blah. And some you did, some you could, some I couldn't. So just before he died, I sent him a thing and said, John, Jay, I've had this request, unable to do this. I find that I will be in Minsk. I'm being awarded a prize at the Minsk Horticultural Show and inducted in as a life member. Brian, he writes back, Dear B, won't be able to make this either. I notice in my diary that my ferret is having open heart surgery. And you think, where are you going to get those conversations from?
Yeah.
And I was talking to Andrew Denton, who was also very close to John, and we had a long chat about this. And he said that's the thing that he will miss, is those conversations and those bits and pieces. And so Andrew and I have taken up one thing that I did with John, and that was the exchange of music. Because we loved all sorts of different music, and we'd swap. You know, there's some pieces of music I can't listen to anymore because it just reminds me. And so Andrew and I have got that going. That sort of helps a bit, you know. Anyway, if we've got to finish, can I just tell you the story John told?
I think you can, Bryan Dawe. I think you can.
This summed John up better than just about anything I can think of, because the thing about John was he was such a warm, caring person, and he wouldn't let certain things go by. There was, for example, a guy called Marcus Craig, who was a transvestite comic that he worked with in New Zealand when he was, John was doing Fred Dagg. And he died. Now this man was nobody, hardly anyone in New Zealand would know him, certainly no one here knew him. So he wrote an article about him, and he acknowledged that he'd worked with him on the stage and whatever, but he found a way of telling a wonderful story at the same time. And he said, we came out of the club together, and there was a white man, very, very drunk, harassing racially the 6'8" bouncer. The bouncer looked at this man, and he'd seen this sort of sophistication before. So he picked him up by the neck of the shirt, turned him around and lifted him up against the wall. And he said to him, listen, in a very soft voice, listen, if you hit me and I ever find out about it, you're fucking dead. Now go home.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Bryan Dawe and Julian Morrow.